opportunity to share some of the findings of this research I've been involved in with you, and I look forward to hearing your comments. Just start with a summary of the central arguments, the contentions in my presentation. And first one is that external aid has helped Ghana, or it did help Ghana, to move on the track of democratic transition in the early 1990s. Second, external aid in general, but particularly democracy assistance, has helped to keep Ghana's democracy on track and has been somewhat helpful in helping Ghana to attain the status of an electoral democracy currently. But I also contend that external aid in general, democracy aid in particular, has had a mixed record when it comes to the consolidation of Ghanaian democracy, institutionalization of democratic norms, and the deepening of the quality of the outputs of democracy. And especially if we are looking at this in the short and medium terms, since in the long term, we don't know where we'll be. I also contend that whatever the impact of external aid and democracy aid have been on Ghana's democratic development, it is likely to wane in the future in the wake of recent developments, the emergence of oil and gas and other natural resource sector generating centrally controlled state resources. And my argument that it is reducing and is likely to reduce reliance on conditioned aid. Also, that the emergence of China and other non-traditional development partners, normally less inclined to emphasize democratic and governance reforms, would also contribute to the waning of Western bilateral and then also multilateral OECD aid impact on Ghana. And I mentioned briefly the decreasing importance, therefore, of Ghana's Western bilateral donors in the scheme of things, and their own increasing resort to budget support. That when it comes to directly impacting democratic governance, I do see some sense in which the overall impact is waning, is going to wane for Ghana. So these are my general summations. I'll try and get to some of the specific points and arrive at a set of conclusions, but maybe not conclusions, but more attempt to draw lessons from Ghana's experience with external assistance, democracy assistance so far, and where I think it's taking Ghana or not taking Ghana, and some of the, and how the future looks in terms of external aid and external democracy assistance in Ghana. Let me, just in the interest of time, if we backtrack to the late 80s, up to 1992, roughly up to 1992, Ghana had only experienced short-lived episodes of democracy, but it also has had a long experience with non-democratic forms of rule. Ghana did embark on a transition to democracy in the early 90s, and this transition, for those of you who know the history of it, was initially deemed to have relatively low prospects. But notwithstanding the pessimism, notwithstanding some promising beginnings, Ghana's democracy has flourished in the Fourth Republic, and that, in contrast to other African countries that joined the so-called third wave of democratization in the 90s, Ghana's democracy has continued to grow instead of experiencing reversals and some of the stagnation that's setting in other countries. Details are, I think, well known to the Ghanaian audience, so I'm going to skip all of it. But just to say that I think it's enough to mention that Ghana today it remains one of the few countries in this era that have experienced electoral turnover or change from one administration to the other through the ballot box, and has done so twice. I also note that Ghana now boasts of a highly vibrant media and active civil society, as for a country that for many decades since independence had been ruled under military or quasi-military rule. Civil military relations have been substantially democratized. Parliament has been reasonably revived, and I would say reasonably because there are other comments, critical comments I'll make about the revival of Parliament so far. So, but in spite of these great achievements in democracy, there are shortcomings. And even before I talk about the contribution that external aid and external democracy aid has made to Ghana's democratization, I like to say that some of these shortcomings prevail. In fact, many of them prevail in spite of democracy support or lack of it. And there's just very few cases in which democracy support or external aid has set Ghana's democracy back, in my view. Just to note that Ghana's elections continue to be fraught with tension, some sporadic violence, and this abuse of incumbency remains the case with all administrations. And we still have a voters register that doesn't really have full integrity, even though it's improving and improved substantially. I think just again to note in terms of the shortcomings, the Ghana has been pursuing decentralization reforms since the late 80s. These reforms are now grounded in the current constitution, but in spite of that, the reforms have generally stalled. There's been a lot of attention to civil society and the media, but the two sectors remain fraught with technical, financial, political, and ethical shortcomings. And most important, in terms of the point I made earlier about external aid and democracy support having made very little impact or not yet made a big impact on the deepening of democracy, I think it's important to note that governmental transparency, accountability, institutional checks and balances, state responsiveness, governmental responsiveness, adherence to the rule of law remain weak. So, for example, I still don't know. Salaries and other conditions of service are tied to the position of the president, minister of state, parliamentarians, and other key state functionaries, even though I am quite well informed about many other aspects of governance and government by interest and by profession. It also remains telling that despite popular pressure as well as donor support and so on, governments so far have been able to resist initiating credible transparency promoting legislation and related instruments. So we still don't have a right to information law, even though one has been in the pipeline from about the late 90s. And the public office holder said disclosure rules we have remain poorly enforced, in addition to being generally bad quality. And the public procurement rules are also inadequately enforced. Then finally, among the major shortcomings, there is still exclusion or inadequate inclusion of women, persons with disability, and other social minorities. And like other places on the continent these days, discrimination against sexual minorities is rife. So now I want to get back to the subject of this discussion, the main focus of this discussion, which is external aid's contribution or lack of it to democracy. And I broadly divide the contribution into two: contributions to the transition to democracy, and then we'll look next at contribution to the consolidation or the post-transition phase of Ghana's democracy. And here I note that the World Bank, IMF, international financial institution, Western donor imposition of political conditionalities on assistance to their client states, such as Ghana, did facilitate the decision of the quasi-military Rawlings government to open up a political system and liberalize Ghanaian politics in the early 1990s. I think, if for nothing at all, this push bolstered the previously rebuffed domestic opposition demand on the Rawlings government to return the country to civilian and democratic rule. After the transition, or at least the formal part of the transition, external support to election administration reform, support to the Electoral Commission, support to media and civil society development, support to Parliament in the 90s, and continuing into the 2000s, helped significantly to prevent what could have been the premature death of Ghana's democratic project. I say premature death because in the first transition election was hotly disputed. The presidential polls were disputed. The parliamentary elections were boycotted by the main opposition parties. So Ghana started its life as a democratic country with more or less de facto one-party parliament. Then also, in addition to direct democracy assistance, I still think some other external assistance not targeted at democracy and governance have had a positive impact on Ghanaian democratization, if for nothing at all, by way of encouragement and therefore subtle incentive for Ghana to move along. And if you look at the timing of the HIPIC reliefs in the early 2000s or the Millennium Challenge account grant in the mid-2000s and others, you get a clear sense that donors were trying to send a message that if you stay the course, there might be some rewards for you of this nature. I think in general, I would say external democracy, external aid, and democracy aid in particular, has helped Ghana to stay on track with democracy. It has helped to make the machinery for election administration relatively efficient, and the election and the outcomes of our elections relatively credible. It has promoted civil liberties, especially freedom of speech, association, media freedom, civil society participation. So I want to now focus on broad lessons that can be drawn from Ghana's experience with external aid and external democracy promotion. I would say from Ghana's experience at least, external aid matters, and that at the very least, it rendered the Rawlings PNDC government less reluctant or perhaps more willing to embark on a democratic transition, despite the fact that it faced a real risk of losing power to its trenchant opponents. Second, that once Ghana's democratic transition was initiated, external aid, particularly democracy aid, helped to keep the transition on track, or at least to prevent it from dying in infancy. But I also note that the domestic environment, including the commitment of the political elite to reforms and their willingness to cooperate with donors, have been equally important. So it wasn't only a matter of donors supplying aid, but there has been some receptivity to it on the part of the domestic political elite. I would also note that in general, external assistance and democracy assistance have been successful in pushing democratic reforms when the commitment of those elites, and especially those in the incumbent regime, has been strong. So, for example, I think domestic elite incumbent regime commitment explains why the Rawlings administration allowed the reforms, the elected Rawlings administration allowed reforms to be made to the electoral system and to the machine, the processes of organizing elections, making them more transparent and so on, to take place in the first place, even though it must have known that those reforms reduced the certainty of the regime holding on to power. Again, I contend that the domestic opposition and civil society's demand for external democracy assistance is also crucial to the effectiveness of whatever external democracy support is given. And that many of the reforms, in fact, to the system of election administration, some of the reforms that made the Electoral Commission of Ghana as strong as it is today, took place because there was strong domestic political opposition as well as civil society and media support for those reforms. So it wasn't only a matter of the government having the commitment, but I do think there was also some demand from without the government. Also, that external assistance, democracy assistance, appear to have a better chance of achieving impact when it is sustained over a relatively long period, as in the case of support to elections in Ghana. I also note that there are clear limits to external aid's ability to promote democratic or any type of reform in a place like Ghana. And that despite sustained external support and push by civil society and media for a right to information law to be passed, and for the public office asset holder disclosure rules to be reformed, bipartisan political elite opposition to these reforms have ensured that they haven't taken place to date. In 2000, the then MPP opposition indicated that it favored the passage of a right to information legislation. It favored reforms to the public office holder set disclosure rules. When it took power in 2001 until it left office, none of these things were done. In 2007, 2008, the then NDC opposition had agreed with civil society activists and the anti-corruption bodies that it was agreeable to the reform of the public office holder asset rules, asset disclosure rules, but in 2009, it changed its mind, or it told us so. Then finally, to note that some desired changes in government and improvements in the quality of democracy and government simply lie beyond the control or leverage of foreign aid, and that some deeply rooted structural and cultural obstacles and factors do not lend themselves to change on account of external stimulation. So in Ghana, for instance, I think if you want to understand why the state capture remains so attractive to politicians, winner takes all prevails, democracy is increasingly clientelized, you've got to understand that it's rooted in the over-concentration of power within the executive branch, presidency, and ruling party, and some of these are linked to the constitutional arrangements we have. Again, even though Parliament has revived, as I said, in many ways, it still remains weak, and certainly weak relative to the executive branch and to the presidency. But then much of that is also rooted in the Constitution, as well as the internal rules of Parliament itself, notably the Parliament's own standing orders. Then, whatever we think foreign aid, external democracy aid has been able to do, and has been able to the extent to which it's impacted on Ghanaian democracy, recent developments in the country and in the world do presage a reduction in such impact down the line. And notable one is Ghana's growing natural resource wealth. And then finally, I think oil and other natural commodity resources, together with the global financial crisis of recent times, appear to be driving Ghana's traditional partners to recalibrate their own established governance benchmarks, and also in their bid to retain access to the state and incumbent administration officials, or to maintain some leverage, they keep widening the goalposts so that government can keep dribbling around with some of its commitments for improvements in governance and democracy. And again, the case of the right to information legislation in Ghana is a key one, because I know it's been on the books as a trigger for MDBS in Ghana since at least 2007. So thank you.